It's an age-old mystery that has gripped the world for more than a century. Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah, DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
For over a century, the name Jack the Ripper has haunted history books and crime scenes alike. People have guessed, argued, and obsessed over who really carried out those brutal killings in 1888. Now, after 137 long years, it seems the answer is finally here, and it's not who anyone expected. This discovery changes everything we thought we knew about one of the world's most chilling mysteries. Could the truth have been hidden in plain sight all along? Join us as we uncover the shocking identity of Jack the Ripper and the surprising evidence that finally brings this case to a close. The dark world of Jack the Ripper. In the late 19th century, London was not the clean and modern city we see today. One part of it, Whitechapel, looked and felt completely different. Life there was hard. The streets were packed with people, but most of them had very little money. The houses were small and broken down. Many families shared one room. The multicultural district in the East End of London smelled of garbage, smoke, and sickness. There was no proper system to clean the streets or handle waste. Once you see how dark Jack the Ripper's world was, you'll understand how he did what he did.
But first, there are thousands of unsolved murders in London, some dating back not just decades, but hundreds of years. The most famous of those, the Jack the Ripper murders, a killing spree which left at least 5 women dead in the East End in 1888. Now, 137 years on from the killings,
and stayed hidden for so long. The Ripper's first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was found early on August 31st, 1888. Her body was left on Bucks Row, now called Durward Street. She had been killed quickly, with her throat cut deep, almost to the spine. But what made it worse was what he did after. Her body was cut in places that showed he was trying to make a statement. A week later, Annie Chapman was found on September 8th. She was left in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Her throat was also cut, but her body was opened up. Parts of her insides were taken out and placed beside her. It looked like someone had done it calmly, not in a rush. Many believed the killer had some kind of skill with a knife. Maybe a doctor. Maybe a butcher.
The phenomena of the serial killer is very much associated with the financial success of a nation.
The third and fourth victims came on the same night, just minutes apart. On September 30th, the body of Elizabeth Stride was found first, but, unlike the others, it wasn't cut open. Some thought the killer had been interrupted. At approximately 1:45 a.m., Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. This time, her face was slashed, her kidney was missing, and a piece of her apron was found nearby with strange writing on the wall above it.
Poor countries not only have serial killers, but as the country gets richer, like in America is the most egregious example, there are reckoned to be 500 serial killers at work at any one time.
The final known victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found on November 9th. She was only 25. Her murder was the most horrifying of all. It happened indoors, in her small rented room on Miller's Court. The police were shocked when they saw that her body had been torn apart. Organs were scattered around the room. Even her face was destroyed beyond recognition. It was as if the killer had taken his time, knowing no one would stop him. These 5 murders shook all of London, not just Whitechapel.
At the time of Jack the Ripper, England was the richest country on earth, bar none, you know. And you're having serial killers emerging in India now because India is wealthy and is going to be super wealthy. So you're going to get more and more of them here. They're known by the FBI as recreational killers.
Newspapers printed every detail. People couldn't stop talking about the killer. Some believed Jack the Ripper was part of a secret group. Others thought he was rich. Maybe even someone powerful. What made it worse was the feeling that anyone could be next. The way the bodies were left, the pattern of the attacks, and the fact that the killer was never caught made people feel unsafe. For the first time, the city faced the idea that a single person could bring this much terror. Even though only 5 women were officially counted as his victims, some historians believe that the true number of Jack the Ripper's victims is higher. The killings exposed how badly the poor in London were living. Before the murders, most of society ignored places like Whitechapel. It was seen as a place full of crime, drunks, and people who didn't try hard enough. But now, the newspapers were forcing the public to look at the photos of dark alleys and run-down buildings filled the pages. The descriptions of starving children and overcrowded shelters made their way into breakfast conversations across the city. And behind it all was Jack the Ripper, whose crimes pushed the suffering of the poor into the spotlight in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore.
In the United States, the reason Jack the Ripper became so famous was his murders coincided with the telegraph and the telephone and the beginning of mass media, mass newspaper publication, and that made him famous, and he was playing up to the press. He loved it.
There were arguments in Parliament at the time, with some saying the government had failed. Why were people living 10 to a room with no heat or clean water? Why did women have to sleep on the streets or in brothels just to survive? Others tried to shift the focus back to catching the killer, but the truth remained that these murders were the result of a system that had left people behind for too long. The story of Jack the Ripper was turning into something more than news. It was entertainment, fear, and outrage all at once. The media also helped shape the idea of the canonical 5. These were the 5 women officially believed to have been killed by the same person. But journalists and the public started treating these women less like real people and more like clues in a twisted puzzle. Their personal lives were picked apart in articles, their photos were printed, and their names became part of London's dark folklore. The London Metropolitan Police had detectives, but very little to work with. There were no DNA tests, as the DNA test, as we know today, was first used in 1986. Most of their work relied on walking the streets, asking questions, and hoping someone saw something. But Whitechapel was not an easy place to question people. The community saw the police as outsiders who didn't care until a body showed up. Some of the people didn't speak English. Others were afraid to talk because they lived in constant fear of being arrested, of losing shelter, or of the Ripper himself. Even if someone had seen something, they might have stayed silent.
And he knew, because he was a very senior Freemason in the same Masonic lodge as the king-to-be, Edward VII, that they couldn't touch him.
There were also too many people in charge. The City of London Police had jurisdiction over the 1 square mile area of the City of London, while the Metropolitan Police covered the other parts of London. The killings happened near the border between both zones. So every time a new body was found, there was confusion over which police force was responsible and who had the final say. Valuable time was lost while they argued or tried to share evidence. The police questioned suspects, chased leads, and even brought in bloodhounds at one point, but they kept running into dead ends. They also received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. Most were hoaxes, but a few stood out, especially one signed Jack the Ripper. That name is responsible for the creation of the pseudonym as we know today. The letter claimed responsibility for the murder of Annie Chapman on the 8th of September and mentioned that an ear would be cut off from the next victim and sent to the police. Whether or not the killer actually wrote it, the damage was done.
It was so cleverly done that every piece of evidence that said he murdered her is counteracted by a piece of evidence that says he couldn't have done it. Okay. And it's a really fascinating case, and I wanted to go after Herbert Wallace.
Now the murderer had a title that sounded like something out of a horror novel. It gave him power, even while he stayed hidden. And every day that passed made it harder for the police. Even worse, the public was growing restless. Crowds gathered outside the crime scenes, with some blaming the Jewish community. Others blamed immigrants. As a result, police officers had to calm mobs, protect suspects from being attacked, and face newspapers calling them failures. But maybe the biggest challenge the police faced was that the Ripper understood the city better than they did.
In 1986 and 87, ready for the centenary, which occurred, of course, in 1988. Now, I found that the man in charge of the inquiry, the head of the CID, had said that the Ripper was a poor Polish Jew.
He seemed to know where to hide and when to vanish. It was almost as if he were watching them too, always one step ahead. Today, looking back, we can see how limited they were in their analysis. It was that they were trying to catch a shadow with their hands. And as we move closer to finding out who that shadow really was, all of this becomes even more important. Well-planned crimes. What set Jack the Ripper apart was how deliberate the crimes were. He targeted women who were poor, often homeless, and working as prostitutes in the East End of London. These women were easy to approach without drawing attention. In that part of Whitechapel, women offering sex for a few pennies was so common that no one would look twice at a man walking off with one into the dark. Each of the 5 canonical victims were killed during the early morning hours, between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. The streets were mostly empty then, and visibility was low. It meant fewer witnesses and fewer interruptions. Whoever the Ripper was.
Aberline was a Freemason. Everyone knew Sir Charles Warren was a Freemason. It was open knowledge. So let's say Aberline is hunting the Ripper, which he wasn't. Warren was supposed to be, which he didn't. He was a misogynist par excellence. He hated women, and one woman in particular that he considered the lowest prostitute on earth.
He understood that timing mattered, because he took the victims' lives with calculation. In Annie Chapman's case, for instance, the backyard she was murdered in was enclosed by fences and walls, not easy to access casually. Yet the killer led her there, performed the murder, mutilated her body, and vanished without anyone seeing him come or go. That suggests familiarity with the area, someone who knew which doors were open and which yards were empty. Then there's Catherine Eddowes, murdered on the same night as Elizabeth Stride, in what's often called the double event. Then he moved on, and within 45 minutes, Eddowes was dead in Mitre Square. This location was in the City of London, not Whitechapel, crossing police boundaries within an hour. Again, it showed planning, or at the very least, confidence in how to move between jurisdictions undetected. The mutilations themselves suggested a killer with at least some knowledge of anatomy. Police surgeon Dr. Thomas Bond examined several of the victims,
and that he had been positively identified. He is the most certain person we have, saying he knew who the Ripper was, who could have...
noted that the killer seemed to know where certain organs were. In Mary Jane Kelly's case, the mutilations were so extensive that parts of her were scattered around the room at 13 Miller's Court. Her heart was missing. Yet no one in the building heard a thing. That level of violence and silence didn't look like an uncalculated attack. And this extended beyond the murders. The killer left almost no physical evidence. The Ripper didn't leave behind personal items. He simply vanished. In a world without cameras, streetlights, or fingerprinting, he seemed to melt back into the shadows. This gave rise to many questions. Some believed he may have worked as a barber surgeon, men trained in basic anatomy, used to cutting flesh. The way he removed organs with apparent precision only added fuel to this idea. Yet no one on record was ever charged with such skills in connection to the crimes. The letters also formed part of his identity, or, at least, the identity the press and public came to believe in. The Dear Boss letter received by the Central News Agency, mocked the police's efforts. Soon after, Catherine Eddowes was found with one earlobe slashed, feeding the belief that the letter could be genuine. Whether the killer actually sent it or not, it showed that whoever he was, he understood how to play the city.
Towards Freemasons, my book isn't about how horrible Freemasons are. Yeah. My book is about how horrible a serial killer was, who happens to be a Freemason, you know. Okay. And the chief of the Metropolitan Police and all his detectives were all Freemasons, all of them.
While the killer's methods terrified the public, they left the police scrambling. Their lack of cooperation became obvious after Eddowes' murder. Near the crime scene, someone had scrawled a message in chalk. "The Jewies are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Sir Charles Warren personally ordered the message erased before it could be photographed, fearing it would spark anti-Semitic riots. That decision remains controversial. Another challenge was also the panic factor. Once the press named Jack the Ripper, Londoners became obsessed. Every shadow looked suspicious. Men were arrested just for carrying knives or acting strangely. Some members of the public even dressed up and pretended to be the killer as a prank. These false leads drained time and resources. On top of that, investigators like Inspector Frederick Aberline had to work under enormous pressure from both the public and government. Aberline was one of the lead detectives from Scotland Yard and was respected for his fieldwork. But even he later admitted they were overwhelmed. The number of tips, hoaxes, and political interference meant genuine leads were often buried. There was also a lack of a unified investigative strategy. One week, police were looking for a butcher. The next, they were arresting doctors. Then immigrants. Then lunatics. Without forensic tools or a proper understanding of criminal profiling, they were searching in every direction at once. And while all this was happening, the killer watched. Whether he followed the news or simply understood how the system worked, he managed to stay out of reach. That silence may be the greatest clue of all, because it suggested that whoever he was, he blended in perfectly.
Okay, so there was an Aberline in real life who was involved in the investigation?
Yeah, he was set up inside the myth as being the detective that was chasing Jack the Ripper to avoid bringing Sir Charles Warren, who was the most famous Freemason alive, into the case. So
that's why, for more than a century, experts kept digging. Because if you understand how Jack the Ripper operated and how flawed the investigation really was, then you get closer to seeing how he got away with it. One of the earliest and most often cited suspects was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and part-time school teacher. Druitt came from a respectable family and was educated at Winchester College and the University of Oxford. He also had a history of mental instability. What drew attention to him was the timing of his death. In December 1888, Druitt's body was pulled from the River Thames, an apparent suicide. A note in the files of Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville McNagden later stated that Druitt was sexually insane, and that his death coincided with the end of the canonical murders. McNagden believed this was important, but he had no hard evidence. Druitt's connection to Whitechapel was weak, and there's no record of him ever being arrested or questioned. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew who lived in Whitechapel and suffered from severe mental illness. He was committed to an asylum in 1891. According to a memo by Sir McNugton, Kosminski was believed to have a strong hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies. Swanson even claimed that Kosminski had been identified by a witness, but the witness refused to testify. Years later, this would become one of the most debated details in ripperology. Some argue Kosminski was the killer, citing his proximity to the crime scenes and his mental instability. But critics point out that he remained in asylums for decades afterward and never displayed behavior similar to the murders again. No physical evidence ever tied him to the crimes. Another suspect was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born thief and con artist with a long criminal record. He was known to use multiple aliases and spent time in various prisons and asylums across Britain and Europe. MacNaughton believed him capable of violence, but later research showed Ostrog was likely incarcerated during the time of the Ripper murders. The theory around him gradually faded as timelines failed to match. There were others, of course. George Chapman, whose real name was Severin Klosowski, was a Polish-born barber surgeon who later poisoned 3 of his wives and was hanged in 1903. Inspector Aberline himself thought Chapman might be a strong suspect, since he had anatomical knowledge and lived in Whitechapel during the killings. But Chapman's known crimes were poisonings, not mutilations, and no evidence ever placed him at a Ripper crime scene. More dramatic theories implicated Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, claiming he had an affair with a Catholic shopgirl and fathered a child, leading to a royal cover-up and multiple murders to silence witnesses. One even claimed he was the Ripper himself. However, this theory that was popularized in books and films has been widely debunked by historians. Prince Albert had documented alibis for the murders, including being nowhere near London during some of them. The same goes for the theory involving Sir William Gull, the royal physician, as part of a Masonic conspiracy. This idea, rooted in fiction more than fact, was glamorized by authors like Stephen Knight in Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, and later films. Yet no verifiable link ever tied Gull to the case. In more recent years, modern forensic interpretations have revived old suspects. In 2014, businessman Russell Edwards claimed he had solved the mystery using mitochondrial DNA found on a shawl supposedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes. The DNA matched a descendant of Kosminski, he said, but critics quickly pointed out flaws in the testing method, contamination risks, and the fact that the shawl's chain of custody was never clearly documented. Without verified provenance, any results from it remain suspect. The truth is, despite the sheer volume of theories, no one has ever been definitively identified as Jack the Ripper. The killer's true identity has eluded generations of police, journalists, and amateur sleuths. But all the same, the details surrounding these suspects, their lives, their movements, and their personalities provide the insight that whoever Jack the Ripper was, he didn't stand out. And that, more than anything, may be that's how he escaped. But what has just been uncovered changes everything. The power of DNA. The revelation brought by DNA testing offers more than just scientific data. For over 137 years, the families of the 5 canonical victims lived in history books as nameless entries under a headline of horror. Their great-grandchildren and beyond never knew why these women were killed or by whom. In a way, the world moved on, but for anyone tied to the memory of Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, or Mary Jane Kelly, the mystery always left something unfinished. So when Russell Edwards and forensic expert Dr. Jari Louhelinen analyzed mitochondrial DNA from the shawl said to be found next to Catherine Eddowes' body, linking it to descendants of both Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski, it was a moment that reopened the file not for the sake of spectacle, but for the sake of truth. While the shawl's chain of custody remains debated, the results suggested that answers, once thought lost to time, could still be found. Forensic science has since advanced dramatically. Mitochondrial DNA, once barely understood, now plays a key role in confirming identities, even with degraded samples. In the United States, cold cases have been solved decades later using techniques like familial DNA matching, where a suspect is traced through a relative. One of the most famous examples is the Golden State Killer case. Between 1974 and 1986, Joseph James DeAngelo committed at least 13 murders and over 50 rapes in California. He evaded capture for more than 40 years until investigators used genealogical databases to find a distant cousin, then narrowed it down to D'Angelo. In 2020, he pled guilty. Also, in Canada, the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessup was finally solved in 2020 when DNA evidence pointed to Calvin Hoover, a man who died in 2015. His name had never even been on the suspect list. Again, genealogical DNA testing made the impossible possible. But these cases also show how dangerous someone can be if they know how to stay invisible. D'Angelo, for instance, worked as a police officer. He understood procedure. He knew how to avoid leaving behind evidence, how to mislead investigators, and when to stop. These kinds of offenders blend into their surroundings easily. They don't just rely on luck. They exploit systems and blind spots. Even with today's advanced tools, crimes committed by meticulous offenders still challenge authorities. The Long Island serial killer case is one such example. The killer left as many as 11 victims, most believed to be sex workers, along Ocean Parkway in Suffolk County, New York. Despite forensic analysis and a major media spotlight, the case remained unsolved for over a decade. Only in 2023 was Rex Heuermann arrested, thanks to newer forensic techniques and cell phone data. But even that took years of complex work. And that's with modern surveillance, digital footprints, and forensics. Imagine then, the challenge in the 19th century. There were no national databases, cameras, or DNA testing. Fingerprinting had only just started being discussed. Criminal profiling didn't exist in a formal sense. And the people investigating the Ripper murders were overwhelmed, short-staffed, and barely equipped for the scale of violence they faced. When you pair that with a killer who moved through back alleys, struck at night, and disappeared into the maze of Whitechapel's streets, it's not surprising that he was never caught. He likely watched the police search while standing nearby. He may have read about himself in the papers and smiled. What DNA breakthroughs teach us is that science can reveal what memory and records cannot. But it also reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a mask. It walks past us on the street. It shops in the same stores. It works in jobs that earn trust. And unless we're looking in the right places with the right tools, it can disappear. What do you think? Did the DNA revelation finally bring justice, or do the unanswered questions still haunt the story? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.